Hello, and welcome back, my lovely Lovecraftians, to A Rat in the Wall by H.P. Lovecraft. Personally, I've been really excited to read this one as there's been a lot of pop culture references lately around backrooms, they're in the walls, the voices, and I am looking forward to the cosmic dread that would continue with rats being in your walls. For those of you who have never experienced this, in some country homes, and some popular phrases is, would you rather choose to be the city mouse or the country mouse? So leave in the comments below as you listen to the story if you would prefer to be the city mouse or the country mouse. On July 16, 1923, I moved into Exham Priory after the last workman had finished his labors. The restoration had been a stupendous task, for little had remained of the deserted pile but a shell-like ruin. Yet, because it had been the seat of my ancestors, I let no expense deter me. This place had not been inhabited since the reign of James I, who had a tragedy of intensity hideous. Though largely unexplained, nature had struck down the master, 5 of his children, and several servants, and driven forth under a cloud of suspicion and terror the 3rd son. My lineal progenitors, and the only survivor of the abandoned line, with the sole heir denounced as a murderer, the estate had reverted to the crown, nor had the accused man made any attempts to exculpate himself or regain his property, taken by some horror greater than that of consequence of the law, and expressing only a frantic wish to exclude the ancient edifice from his sight and memory. Walter de la Poer, 11th Baron Exham, fled to Virginia, and there founded the family which by the next century had become known as the de la Poers. Exham Priory had remained untenanted, though later allocated to the estates of the Norris family, and much studied because of its peculiar composite of architecture. An architecture involving Gothic towers resting on a Saxon or Romanesque substructure, whose foundation in turn was a still earlier order of blend of orders of Roman and even Judaic or native Kiriaman. If legend speaks truly, this foundation was a very singular thing, being merged on one side with the solid limestone of the precipice from whose brink the priory overlooked a desolate valley 3 miles west of the village of Ancestors. Architects and antiquarians love to examine this strange relic of forgotten cultures of centuries, but the country folk hated it. They hated it so much that hundreds of years before, when my ancestors lived there, and the ones before the ancestors lived there, I knew came of the accursed house, that there was moss and mold and abandonment on it. I had not been a day in the Exham Priory until the workmen had blown up the parts and busy altering traces of its foundation. The bare statistics of my ancestry I had always known, together with the fact that my first American forebear had come to the colonies under a strange cloud of details. However, I had been kept wholly ignorant through the policy of resistance always maintained by the de la Poers. Unlike our planter neighbors, we seldom boasted of crusading ancestors or other medieval and Renaissance heroes, nor was any kind of tradition handed down except what may have been recorded in the sealed envelopes left before the Civil War by every squire to his eldest son for posthumous opening. The glories were cherished in the archives since the migration, the glories of a proud and honorable, if somewhat reserved and unsocial, Virginian line. During the war, our fortunes were extinguished and our whole existence changed by the burning of Carfax. Our home on the banks of the James, my grandfather, advanced in years, had perished in that incredulous outrage, and with him the envelope that bound us all to the past. I can recall that fire today, as I saw it then at the age of 7. My father was in the army defending Richmond, and after many formalities, my mother and I were passed through the lines to join him. When the war ended, we all moved north, whence my mother had come, and I grew to manhood, middle age, and ultimate wealth. as a stolid Yankee. Neither my father nor I ever knew what our hereditary in the envelope had contained, and as I merged into the grayness of Massachusetts business life, I lost all interest in what would be the mysteries which eventually lurked far beyond back in my family tree. Had I suspected their nature, how gladly I would have left Exham Priory in the moss, bats, and cobwebs. My father died in 1904, but without any message to leave me, or to my only child, Alfred, a motherless boy of 10. It was this boy who reserved the order of the family information, for although I could give him only jesting conjectures about the past, he wrote me of some very interesting ancestral legends. When the late war took him to England in 1917 as an aviation officer. Apparently, the Delaportes had a colorful and perhaps sinister history. For a friend of my son's, Captain Edward Norreys of the Royal Flying Corps, dwelt near the family seat at Archester's and relayed some impressive superstitions, which few novelists could equal for wildness, and incredibly, Norreys himself, of course, did not take them seriously, but they amused my son and made good material for his letters to me. It was this legendary which definitely turned my son's attention towards his transatlantic heritage and made me resolve to purchase and restore the family seat which the Norreys shewed to Alfred in its picturesque desertion and offered to get for him at a surprisingly reasonable figure, since his own uncle was the present owner. I bought the Exham Priory in 1918, but was almost immediately distracted from my plans of restoration by the return of my son as a married invalid. During the 2 years he lived, I thought of nothing but his care, having even placed my business under the direction of partners in 1921, as I found myself bereaved and aimless, a retired manufacturer no longer young. I resolved to divert my remaining years with my new possession. Visiting Manchester in December, I was entertained by the Captain Norreys, a plump, admirable young man who had thought much of my son, and secured his assistance in gathering plans and anecdotes to guide in the coming restoration. Exham Priory itself I saw without emotion, a jumble of tottering medieval ruins covered with lichens and honeycombed with rocks, a nest perched precariously upon a precipice and dunned of floors or other inferior features save the stone walls of the separate towers. As I gradually recovered the image of the edifice as it had been when my ancestors lived it over 3 centuries before, I began to hire workmen for the reconstruction. In every case, I was forced to go outside the immediate locality, where the Anchester's village had almost unbelievably fear and hatred of the place. This sentiment was so great that it was sometimes communicated to the outside laborers, causing numerous desertions. While its scope appeared to include both the priory and its ancient family, my son had told me that he had somewhat avoided during his visits because he was a Delaporte, and I now found myself subsequently ostracized for a like reason until I convinced the peasants how little I knew of my heritage. Even then, the Norreys did not seem to sullenly dislike me, but so that I had to collect most of the village traditions through the meditations of such. What the people could not do was forgive. Perhaps was that I had come to restore a symbol so abhorrent for them, for rationally or not, they view Exham Priory as nothing less than a haunt of fiends and werewolves. Piecing together the tales which the Norreys collected for me, and supplementing them with the accounts of several savants who had studied the ruins, I deduced the Exham Priory stood on the site of a prehistoric temple, a Druidic and anti-Druidic thing, which must have been contemporary with Stonehenge. The inscribable rites had been celebrated there, few doubted, and there were, of course, unpleasant tales of the transference of these rites into the Celebi worship which the Romans had introduced. Inscriptions still visible in the subcellar bore such unmistakable letters as Div Ups Magna Mat, sign of the Magna Mater's whose dark worship was once vainly forbidden to Roman citizens. Manchester had the camp of the 3rd Augustus Legion, and as many remains at least. And it was said that the Temple of Cymele was splendid and thronged with worshippers who had performed nameless ceremonies at the building of the Pythagorean priest. Tales added that the fall of the old religion did not end the orgies at the temple, but that the priests lived on in the new faith without real change. Likewise, was it said that the rites did not vanish with the Roman power, and that certain among the Saxons added to it the remains of the temple, was the essential outline and subsequently preserved, making it the century of a cult feared through half the high purgatory. About 1000 AD, the place is mentioned in a chronicle as being a substantial stone priory housing a strange and powerful mosaic order, and surrounded by extensive gardens which needed no walls to exclude a frightened populace. It was never destroyed by the Danes, though the Norman conquest it must have declined tremendously, since there was no impediment that the Henry III granted the site to my ancestor, Gilbert de la Poer, 1st Baron, Exham, year circa 1261. Of my family before the date, there is no evil report, but something strange must have happened then. In one chronicle, there is a reference to the de la Poer as cursed of God in 1307, whilst village legendary had nothing but evil and traumatic fears to tell of the castle that went up with the foundations of the old temple and priory. The fireside tales were of the most grisly description, all the ghastlier because of their frightened resistance and cloudy aversions. They represented my ancestors as a race of hereditary demons besides who, Gilles de Retz and the Marquise de Sade, would seem the various tyros and hinted whisperingly at their responsibilities for the occasional disappearance of villagers throughout several generations. The worst characters apparently were the barons and their direct heirs. At least, most were whispered about these. If of healthier incantations, it was said, as the heir would early and mysteriously die to make way for another more typical scion. They seemed to be an inner cult in the family, presided over by the head of the house and sometimes closed except to a few members. Temperament rather than the ancestry was evidently the basis of this cult. It was entered by several who married into the family. Lady Margaret Trevor from Cornwall, wife of Godfrey, the second son of the 5th Baron, became a favorable bane of the children all over the countryside, and the daemon heroine of a particularly horrible ballad, not yet extinct near the Welsh border, preserved in balladry too. Though not illustrating the same point, is the hideous tale of Lady Mary de la Poer, who shortly after her marriage to the Earl of Shrewsfield was killed by him and his mother, both of the slayers being absolved and blessed by a priest to whom they confessed what they dared not repeat to the world. These myths and ballads, typically as they were of crude superstition, repelled me greatly. Their precedence and their application is to so long a line of my ancestors were especially annoying, while the imputations of monstrous habits proved unpleasantly reminiscent of one known scandal of my immediate forebears, the case of my cousin, young Randolph de la Poer of Carfax, who went among different people and became a voodoo priest as he returned from the Mexican War. I was much less disturbed by the vaguer tales of wails and hollering in the barrens, wind-swept valleys beneath the limestone cliff of the graveyard trenches of the spring's rains, of the floundering squealing of the white thing of Sir John Clav's horse, had trotted one night in a lonely field, and of the servant who had gone mad at what he saw in the primary of the full day of light. These things were hackneyed spectral lore, and I was at the time a pronounced skeptic. The accounts of vanished peasants were less to be dismissed, though not especially significant in the view of the medieval custom. Crying curiously meant death, and more than one severed head had been publicly shown on the bastions now faced around the Exham Priory. A few of the tales were exceedingly picturesque and made me wish I had learned more of the comparative mythology in my youth. There was, for instance, the belief that a legion of bat-winged devils kept witches of Sabbath each night at the Priory, a legion whose substance might explain the disproportion of abundance of coarse vegetables harvested in the vast garden. And most more vivid of all, there was a dramatic epic of the rat, the scampering army of obscene vermin which had burst forth from the castle 3 months after the tragedy that doomed it to desertion, the lean, filthy, ravenous army which had swept all before it, endowed foul cats, dogs, hogs, sheep, and even 2 hapless human beings before its fury was spent. Around the unforgettable rodent army, a whole separate cycle of myths revolved, or it scattered among the village homes and brought curses and horrors in its train. Such was the lore that assailed me as I pushed to completion, with an elderly obscenity that the work of restoring my ancestors' home. It must be imagined for a moment that these tales formed my principal psychology in the environment. On the other hand, I was constantly praised and encouraged by Cap Norris and the antiquarians who surrounded and aided me. When the task was done, over 2 years after its commencement, I viewed the great rooms of wainscoted walls, vaulted ceilings, mullioned windows, and broad staircases with a pride which fully compensated for the precocious expenses of the restoration. Every attribute of the Middle Ages was cunningly reproduced, and the new parts blended perfectly with the original walls and foundations. The seat of my fathers was complete, and I looked forward to redeeming at last the local fame of the line which had ended me. I would reside here permanently, and prove that a de la Poor, for I had adopted again the original spelling of the name, need not be a fiend. My comfort was perhaps augmented by the fact that although Exham Priory was medievally fitted, its interior was in truth wholly new and free from old vermin and old ghosts alike. As I have said, I moved in on July 16, 1923. My household consists of 7 servants and 9 cats, of which a later species I'm particularly fond of. My eldest cat, being H.P. Lovecraft's cat's name, was 7 years old, and had come with me from my home in Bolton, Massachusetts. The others I had acquainted whilst living with Captain Norrie's family during the restoration of the Priory. For 5 days, a routine proceeded with the utmost placidity, my time being spent mostly in the codification of old family data. I had now obtained some very circumstantial accounts of the family tragedy and the flight of Walter de la Poer, which I conceived to be the probable contents of the hereditary paper lost in the fire at Carfax. It appears that my ancestors were accused with much reason of having killed all the other members of his household except 4 servant confederates in their sleep, about 2 weeks after a shocking discovery which changed his whole demeanor, but which, except by implication, he disclosed to no one, save perhaps the servants who assisted him, and afterwards fled beyond reach. This deliberate slaughter, which included a father, 3 brothers, and 2 sisters, was largely condoned by the village, and so slackly treated by the law that its perpetrator escaped honored and unharmed. And undisguised to Virginia, the general whispered sentiment being that he had purged the land of an immemorable curse. What discovery had prompted an act so terrible, I could scarcely even conjecture. Walter de la Poer must have known for years the sinister tales about his family, so that this material could have given him no fresh impulse. Had he then witnessed some appalling ancient rite, or stumbled upon some frightful and revealing symbol in the priory of his vicinity, he was reputed to have been a shy, gentle youth in England. In Virginia he seemed not so much hard or bitter as harassed and apprehensive. He was spoke of in the diary of another gentleman adventurer, Francis Harley of Bellevue, as a man of unexampled justice, honor, and delicacy. On July 22nd occurred the first incident which, though lightly dismissed at the time, takes on a preternatural significance in relations to later events. It was so simple as to be almost negligible and could not possibly have been noticed under the circumstances, for it must be recalled that since I was in a building particularly fresh and new, except for the walls, and surrounded by a well-balanced staff of servitors, apprehension would have been absurd, despite the locality. That what I afterwards remembered is merely this: that my old black cat, whose moons I knew oh so well, was doubtfully alert and anxious to an extent wholly out of keeping with his natural character. He roved from room to room, restless, oh so restless and disturbed, and sniffed constantly about the walls, which formed part, yes, oh so part of that. I could almost see the old Gothic structures itself. I realize how trite this sounds, like an inevitable dog in the ghost story, which always growls before his master sees the sheeted figure, yet I cannot consistently suppress it. The following day, a servant complained of restlessness among the cats in the house. He came to me in the study, a lofty west room on the second story, with groined eggs, black oak paneling, and a triple Gothic window overlooking the limestone cliff and desolate valley. And even as the paneling of this all, he spoke, I saw the jetty form of H.P. Lovecraft's cat creeping along the west wall and scratching at the new panels which overlaid the ancient stone. I told the man there must be some singular odor, maybe of emaciation from the old stonework, impeccable to human senses, but affecting the delicate organs of the cats, even though the new woodwork was what I truly believed. And when the fellow suggested the presence of mice or rats, I mentioned that there had been no rats there for 300 years, and that even the field mice of the surrounding country could hardly be found in these high walls, where they had never been known to stray. That afternoon I called on Captain Norrie, and he assured me that it would be quite incredible for field mice to infest the Priory in such a sudden and unprecedented fashion. That night, dispensing as usual with a valet, I retired in the West Tower chamber, which I had to put a book away and go to bed that night. From the study by a stone staircase and short gallery, the formal, partly ancient, and latter entirely restored the room was circular, very high, and without wainscoting, being hung with the arras which I had myself chosen in London. Seeing that H.P. Lovecraft's cat was with me, I shut the heavy Gothic door and retired by the light of the electric bulbs which so cleverly counterfeited the candles, finally switching off the light and sinking on the carved and canopied four-poster, which the vengeful cat in his customs placed across my feet. I did not draw the curtains, but gazed out the narrow north window which I faced. There was a suspicion of aurora in the sky, and the delicate traceries of the window were pleasantly silhouetted. At some time I must have fallen quietly asleep, for I recall a distinct sense of leaving strange dreams. When the cat started violently from his placid position, I saw him in the faint auroral glow, head strained forward, 4 feet on my ankles, and hind feet stretched behind. He was looking intensely at a point on the wall somewhat west of the window, a point which to my eyes had nothing to mark it, but towards which all my attention was now directed. And as I watched, I knew that H.P. Lovecraft's cat was not vainly excited. Whether the arras actually moved, I cannot say. I think it did, very slightly, but what I can swear to is that behind it, I heard a low, distinct stirring as of rats or mice. In a moment, were there. The cat jumped boldly on the screen tapestry, bringing the affected sections to the floor. With his weight and exposing a damp, ancient wall of stone, patched here and there by the restorers, and devoid of any trace of rodent prowlers, H.P. Lovecraft's cat raced up and down the floor by this part of the wall, crawling the fallen arras and seemingly trying at times to insert a paw between the wall and the oaken floor. He found nothing, and after a time returned wearily to his place across my feet. I had not moved, but I did not sleep again that very night. In the morning, I questioned all the servants and found that none of them had noticed anything unusual, save that the cook remembered the actions of a cat which had rested on her windowsill. This cat said to have howled at some unknown hour of the night, awakening the cook in the time for her to see him dart purposely upon the open door down the stairs. I drowsed away by the noontime, and in the afternoon called again on Captain Norris, who became exceedingly interested in what I told him. The odd incident, so slight yet so curious, appealed to his sense of the picturesque and elegant form, hidden in a number of reminiscences of local ghostly lore. We were genuinely perplexed at the presence of rats, and Nori lent me some traps in Paris Green, which I had the servants place in strategic localities when I returned. I retired early, being very sleepy, but was harassed by my dreams of the most horrible sort. I seemed to be looking down from an immense height upon a twilit grotto knee-deep with filth, whereas a white-bearded daemon swineherd drove about his staff a flock of fungus-flabby beasts, whose appearance filled me with an unutterable loathing. Then, as the swineherd paused and nodded over his task, a mighty swarm of rats rained down on the stingily abyss and fell to the devouring beast and man alike. From this terrific visions, I was abruptly awakened by the motions of H.P. Lovecraft's cat, who had been sleeping as usual across my feet. This time, I did not have to question the source of his snarls and hisses, and of the fear which made him sink his claws into my ankle, unconscious of their effect. For on every side of the chamber the walls were alive with nauseous sound, and the vermis slithering of ravenous, gigantic rats. There was no aurora to shew the state of the arras, the fallen sections of which had been replaced, but I was not too frightened to switch on the light. As the bulbs leapt into a radiance, I saw a hideous shaking all over the tapestry, causing the somewhat peculiar designs to execute a singular dance of death. This motion disappeared almost at once, and the sound with it. Springing out of bed, I poked at the arras with the long handle of a warming pan and nested near, and lifted one section to see what lay beneath. There was nothing but the patched stone wall, and even the cat had lost its tense realization of abnormal presence. When I examined the circular trap that had been placed in the room, I found all the openings sprung, though no trace remained of what had caught and then had escaped. Further sleep was out of the question, so, lighting a candle, I opened the door and went out in the gallery towards the stairs of my study, H.P. Lovecraft's cat following at my heels. Before we had reached the stone steps, however, the cat darted ahead of me and vanished down the ancient flight. As I descended the stairs myself, I became suddenly aware of sounds in the great room below, sounds of a nature which could not be mistaken. The oak panels' walls were alive with rats, scampering and milling, whilst H.P. Lovecraft's cat was racing about with the fury of a baffled hunter. Reaching the bottom, I switched on the light, which did not this time cause the noise to subside. The rats continued their riot, stamping with such force and distinctness that I could finally assign to their motions a definite direction. These creatures, in numbers apparently inexhaustible, were engaged in one stupendous migration from inconceivable heights to some depths conservatively or inconceivably below. I now heard steps in the corridor, and in another moment 2 servants pushed open the massive door. They were searching the house for some unknown source of disturbance, which had thrown all the cats into a snarling panic and caused them to plunge precipitously down several flights of stairs and squat, yowling before the closed door to the sub-cellar. I asked them if they heard the rats, but they replied in the negative, and when I turned to call their attention to the sounds of the panels, I realized that the noise had ceased. With the 2 men, I went down the door of the sub-cellar, but realized I found that the cats had already dispersed. Later, I resolved to explore the crypt below, but for the present, I merely made a round of the traps. All were sprung, yet all were tenantless, satisfying myself that no one had heard the rats save the felines and me. I sat in my study till morning, thinking profoundly, recalling every scrap of legend I had unearthed concerning the building I inhabited. I slept some in the forenoon, leaning back in the one comfortable library chair, which my medieval plan of furnishing could not varnish. Later, I telephoned to Captain Norris, who came over and helped me explore the sub-cellar. Absolutely nothing untoward was found, although we could not repress a thrill at the knowledge that this vault was built by Roman hands. Every low arch and massive pillar was Roman. Not the debased Romanesque of the bungling Saxons, but the severe and harmonious classicism of the ages of Caesar. Indeed, the walls abounded with inscriptions familiar to the antiquities who had repeatedly explored the place, things like Agit prop temp dona and Laud prerec vers pontificates. The references to Aetius made me shiver, for I had read Catullus and knew something of the hideous rites of the Eastern god, whose worship was so mixed that the Sebli, Norris, and I, by the light of the lantern, tried to interpret the odd and nearly effaced designs of certain irregularity. Rectangular blocks of stone, generally held to be altars, but could make nothing of them. We remembered that one pattern, a sort of rayed sun, was held by students to imply a non-Roman origin, suggesting that these altars had merely been adopted by the Roman priest from some older and perhaps aboriginal temple of the same site. On one of these blocks were some brown stains, which made me wonder. The largest in the center of the room had certain features on the upper surface which indicate in connection with fire, probably burnt offerings. Such were the sights in the crypt before whose doors the cats had howled, and when Norris and I now determined to pass the night, couches were brought down by the servants, who were told not to mind any nocturnal actions of the cats, and H.P. Lovecraft's cat was admitted as much for help as for companionship. We decided to keep the great oak door, a modern replica with slits for ventilation, tightly closed. And with this attended to, we retired with lanterns still burning to await whatever might occur. The vault was very deep, and the foundations of the priory, undoubtedly far down on the face of the bleeding limestone cliff overlooking the waste valley. This, that it had been, and the goal of the scuffling and unexplainable rats I could not doubt, though why I could not tell. As we lay there expectantly, I found my vigil occasionally mixed with half-formed dreams, from which uneasy motions of the cat across my feet would rouse me. These dreams were not wholesome, but horribly like the one I had had the night before. I saw again the twilight grotto, and the swineherd with his unmentionable fungus beast swallowing in filth, and I looked at these things. They seemed nearer and more distinct, so distinct that I could almost observe their features. Then I did observe the flabby features of one of them, and awakened with such a scream that H.P. Lovecraft's cat started up, whilst Captain Norris, who had not slept, laughed considerably. Norris might have laughed more, or perhaps less, had he known what it was that made me scream. But I did not remember myself till later. Ultimate horror often paralyzes memory in a merciful way. Nori's Wake Me with the phenomenon began out of the same frightened dream. I was calmed by his gentle shaking and his urging to listen to the cat. Indeed, there was much to listen to, for beyond the closed door, at the head of the stone steps, was a veritable nightmare of feline yelling and clawing, whilst H.P. Lovecraft's cat, unmindful of his kindred outside, was running excitedly around the bare stone walls, in which I heard the same babble of scurrying rats that had troubled me the night before. An acute terror now rose within me, for here were anomalies which nothing normal could well explain. These rats, if not the creatures of madness which I shared with the cats alone, must be burrowing and sliding in Roman walls I had thought of to be solid limestone blocks, unless perhaps the action of water through more of the 17th century had eaten winding tunnels which rodents' bodies had worn clear and ample. But even so, the spectral horror was no less, for if these were living vermin, why did not Nori hear their disgusting commotion? Why did he urge me to watch H.P. Lovecraft's cat and listen to the cats outside? And why did he guess wildly and vaguely at what could have aroused them? By the time I had managed to tell him, as rationally as I could, what I thought I was hearing, my ears gave me the last fading impression of the scurrying, which had retreated still downward, far underneath his deepest of subcellars, till it seemed as if the whole cliff below were riddled with questing rats. Nori, he was not as skeptical as I had anticipated, but instead seemed profoundly moved. He motioned to me to notice that the cats at the door had ceased their clamor, as if giving up the rats for lost, while H.P. Lovecraft's cat had a burst of renewed relentlessness and was clawing frantically around the bottom of the large stone altar in the center of his room, which was nearer Nori's couch than mine. My fear of the unknown was at this point very great. Something astounding had occurred, and I saw that Captain Norris, a younger, stouter, and presumably more naturally materialistic man, was affected fully as much as myself, perhaps because of his lifelong and intimate familiarity with local legend. We could, for the moment, do nothing but watch the old man's black cat as he pawed with the decreasing favor at the base of the altar, occasionally looking up and mewing to me in that persuasive manner which he used when he wished for me to perform some favor for him. Nori now took a lantern closer to the altar and examined the place where H.P. Lovecraft's cat was pawing, silently kneeling and scraping away the lichens of centuries which joined the massive pre-Roman block to the testile floor. He did not find anything. He was about to abandon his effort when I noticed a trivial circumstance which made me shudder. Even though it implied nothing more than I had already imagined, I told him of it, and we both looked at its almost imperceptible manifestation with the fixest of fascination's discovery and acknowledgment. It was only this, that the flame of the lantern set down near the altar was slightly but certainly flickering from a draught of air which it had not been before received, and which came inevitably from the crevice between the floor and the altar where Norris was scraping away the lichens. We spent the rest of the night in the brilliantly lighted study, nervously discussing what we should do next. The discovery that some vault deeper than the deepest known masonry of the Romans underlay this accursed pile, some vault unsuspected by the curious antiquarians of 3 centuries, would have been sufficient to excite us without any background of our adventure. But it'd be sinister. As it was, the fascination would become twofold, and we paused in doubt whether to abandon our search and quit the prairie forever, its superstitious caution, or to gratify our sense of adventure and brave whatever horrors might await us in the unknown depths. By morning, we had compromised and decided to go to London to gather a group of archaeologists and scientific men fit to cope with the mystery. It should be mentioned that before leaving the subcellar We had vainly tried to move the central altar, which we now recognize as a gate to a new pit of nameless fear. What secret would open the gate? Wiser men than we would have to find. During many days in London, Captain Norreys and I presented our facts, conjunctions, and legendary antidotes to 5 eminent authorities, all men who could be trusted to respect any family disclosure which future explorations might develop. We found most of them little disposed to scoff, but instead intensely interested and sincerely sympathetic. It is hardly necessary to name them all, but I may say that they include Sir William Britton, whose excavations in the Troad excited most of the world in their day. As we all took the train for Anchester, I felt myself poised on the brink of frightful revelations, a sensation symbolized by the air of mourning among the many Americans at the unexpected death of the President on the other side of the world. On the evening of August 7th, we reached Exham Priory, where the servants assured me that nothing unusual had occurred. The cats, even old H.P. Lovecraft's cat, had been perfectly placid, and not a trap in the house had been sprung. We were about to begin exploring on the following day, awaiting which I assigned well-appointed rooms for all my guests. I myself retired to my own tower chamber, with H.P. Lovecraft's cat across my feet. Sleep came quickly, but hideous dreams assailed me. There was a vision of a Roman feast like that of Trimalchio, which a horror in a covered platter, and then came that damnable recurrent thing about the swineherd and the filthy drove in the Twilt Grotto. Yet when I awoke, it was full daylight, with normal sounds in the house below. The rats, living or spectral, had not troubled me, and H.P. Lovecraft's cat was quietly asleep. On going down, I found the same tranquillity had prevailed elsewhere, a condition which one of the assembled savants, a fellow named Thornton, devoted to the psychic, rather absurdly laid to the fact that I had now been shrewn, the things which certainty forces had wished to shrew me. All was now ready, and at 11 a.m. our entire group of 7 men, bearing powerful electric searchlights and implements of excavation, went down to the sub-cellar and bolted the door behind us. H.P. Lovecraft's cat was with us, for the investigation found no occasion to despite his excitability, and were indeed anxious that he had been present in case of obscure rodent manifestations. We noted the Roman inscriptions and unknown altar designs only briefly, for 3 of the savants had already seen them and all knew their characteristics. Prime attention was paid to the monstrous central altar, and within an hour Sir William Britton had caused it to tilt backwards, balanced by some unknown species of counterweights. There now lay revealed such a horror as would have overwhelmed us had we not been prepared, though a nearly square opening in the tiled floor, sprawling on a flight of stone steps so prodigiously worn that it was little more than an inclined plane of the century, was a ghastly array of human or semi-human bones, those which retained their collection as skeletons were shrewd attitudes of panic or fear, and over all were the marks of rodents gnawing. The skulls denoted nothing short of utter idiocy, centuritum or primitive semi-epidems. Above the hellishly littered steps arced a descending passage, seemingly chiseled from solid rock, and conducting a current of air. This current was not a sudden and noxious rust, as if from a closed vault, but a cool breeze, with something was of freshness in it. We did not pause long, but shiveringly began to clear a passage down the steps. It was then that Sir William, examining the hard walls, made the odd observation that the passage, according to the direction of the strokes, must have been chiseled from beneath. I must be very deliberate now, and choose my words oh so carefully. After plowing down a few steps amidst the gnawed bones, we saw that there was light ahead. Not any mystic phosphorescence, but a filtered daylight which could not come, except for unknown and fissures in the cliff that overlooked the Waste Valley. That such fissures had escaped notice from outside was hardly remarkable, for not only is the valley wholly uninhabited, but the cliff is so high and beetling that only an aeronaut could study its face in detail. A few more steps, and our breaths were literally snatched from us by what we saw, so literally that Thornton, the psychic investigator, actually fainted in the arms of the dazed man who stood behind him. Norris, his plump face utterly white and flabby, simply cried out inarticulately, whilst I think that what I did was to grasp or hiss and cover my eyes. The man behind me, the only one of the party older than I, croaked with hacking neck, "My God," in the most cracked voice I had ever heard. Of 7 cultivated men, only Sir William Britton retained his composure, a thing more to his credit because he led the party and must have seen the sight first. It was a 12th grotto of enormous height, stretching away farther than the eye could see, a subterraneous world of limitless mystery and horrible suggestion. There were buildings and other architect remains. In one terrified glance I saw a weird pattern of tumult, a savage circle of monoliths, a low domed Roman ruin, a sprawling Saxon pile, and an early English edifice of wood. But all these were dwarfed by the ghoulish spectate present by the general surface of the ground. For yards about the steps extended an insane tangle of human bones, or bones at least as human as those on the steps. Like a foamy sea, they stretched, some fallen apart, but others wholly or partly articulated skeletons. These later, inevitably impostures of demonic frenzy, either fighting off some menace or clutching other forms with cannibal intent. When Dr. Task, the anthropologist, stood by to classify the skulls, he found a degraded mixture which utterly baffled him. They were mostly lower than the Piltdown man in the scale of evolution, but in every case definitely human. Many were of higher grade, and a very few were the skulls of what supremely and sensibly developed types. All the bones were gnawed, mostly by rats, but somewhat by others of the half-human drove. Mixed with them were many tiny bones of rats, fallen members of the lethal army which closed the ancient epoch. I wondered that any man among us lived and kept his sanity through this hideous day of discoverability. Not Hoffman or Hussman could convince a scene more wildly incredible, more frenetically repellent, or more gothically grotesque than the 12th grotto, though which we 7 staggered, each stumbling on revelation after revelation, and trying to keep the nuance from thinking of the events which must have taken place there 300 years, or 1,000, or 2,000, or 10,000 years ago. It was an antechamber of hell. And poor Thornton fainted again when Trask told him that some of the skeleton things must have been descendants as quadrupled through the last 20 or more generations. Horror piled on horror as we began to interpret the architectural remains. The quadruped Thanes, with their occasional recruits from the bipedal class, had been kept in stone pens, out of which they must have broken in their last delirium of hunger or rat fear. There had been great herds of them, evidently fattened on the coarse vegetables whose remains could be found as a sort of poisonous and salvage at the bottom of the huge stone bins older than Rome itself. I knew now why my ancestors had had such excessive gardens. Would to heaven I could forget. The purpose of the herds I did not have to ask. Sir William, standing with his searchlight in the Roman room, translated aloud the most shocking ritual I had ever known, and told of the diets of the anthelitic cult which the priest of Silo found and mingled with their own. Norris, used as he was to the trenches, could not walk straight when he came out of the English building. It was a butcher's shop and kitchen. He had expected that, but it was too much to see familiar English impediments in such a place, and to read familiar English graffiti there, some as recent as 1610. I could not go in that building whose daemons' activities were stopped only by the dagger of my ancestor Walter de la Poer. What I did venture to enter was a low Saxon building whose oaken doors had fallen, and there I found a terrible row of 10 stone cells with rusty bars. 3 had tenants, all skeletons of high grade, and on the bony forefinger of one I found a seal ring with my own coat of arms. Sir William found a vault with far older cells below the Roman chapel, but these cells were empty. Below them was a low crypt with cases of formerly arranged bones, some of them bearing terrible parallel inscriptions carved in Latin, Greek, and the tongue of Thryg. Meanwhile, Dr. Task had opened one of the prehistoric tumuli and brought to light skulls which were slightly more human than a gorilla's and which bore indescribable ideographic carvings. Though all the horror my cat stalked unperturbed, once I saw him monstrously perched atop a mountain of bones and wondered at the secrets that might lie behind his shining yellow eyes. Having grasped to some slight degree the fright and revelations of the 12th area, an area so hideously foreshadowed by my recurrent dream, we turned to that apparently boundless depth of midnight cavern where no ray of light from the cliff could penetrate. We shall never know what sightless Stygian world yawns beyond the little distance we went, for it was decided that such secrets are not good for mankind. But there was plenty to engross us at hand, for we had not gone far before the searchlight strewed that accursed infinity of pits in which these rats had feasted, and whose sudden lack of replenishment had driven the ravenous rodent army first to turn on the living herds of starving things, and then to burst forth from the Priory in the historic orgy of devastation which the peasants will never forget. God, those carrion black pits of sowweed, picked bones, and open skulls, those nightmarish chasms choked with the pinnacled of Celtic, Roman, and English bones of countless unhallowed centuries. Some of them are full, and none can say how deep they had once been. Others were still bottomless to our searchlight, and people, by unnameable fancies, what I thought of a hapless rats that stumbled into such traps amidst the blackness of their quest in this grisly Tartarus. Once my foot slipped near a horribly yawning brink, and I had a moment of ecstatic fear. I must have been musing a long time, for I could not see any of the party but the plump-capped Norries. Then there came a sound from the inky boundless farther distance that I thought I knew, and I saw my old black cat dart past me like a winged Egyptian gone straight into the limitless gulf of the unknown. But I was not far behind, for there was no doubt, after another second, it was the eldritch scream of those fiend-born rats, always questing for new horns, and determined to lead me onto those grinning caverns of Earth's century, where Nartha the mad faceless god howls blindly to the piping of 2 atmosphere idiot flute players. My searchlight expired, but I still ran. I heard voices and yowls and echoes, but above all these gently rose the impetuous, insidious scurrying, gently rising more, as a stiff, bloated corpse gently rises above an oily river that flows under an endless onyx bridge to a black putrid sea. Something bumped into me, something soft and plump. It must have been the rats, the vicious, gelatinous, ravenous army that feast on the dead and the living. Why shouldn't rats eat a de la poire, as a de la poire eats forbidden things? The war ate my boy. Damn them all. And the Yanks ate Carfax with the flames and the burnt grandsides de la poire and the secret. No, I tell you, I am not that Damon swineherd in 12th grotto. It was not Edward Nord's fat face on that flabby fungus thing. Who says I am a de la poire? He lived, but my boy died. Shall a Norse hold the lands of de la poire? It's voodoo, I tell you. That spotted snake, curse you, Thornton. I'll teach you to faint with my family dues. Just blood, thou stinker. I'll learn ye to gust. Would ye swinken mean twigs? Magra marda, magna martyr, adies dieger truus. Agris bas durksnort, doras delor, ort agis lesta. Ungul rachit. That is what they say. I said when they found me in the blackness after 3 hours, found me crouching in the blackness over the plump, half-eaten body of Captain Norris with my own cat leaping and tearing at my throat. Now they have blown up Exham Priory, taken my H.P. Lovecraft's cat away from me, and shut me into this barred room at Hadwell's with fearful whispers about my hereditary and experiences. Thornton is in the next room, but they prevent me from talking to him. They are trying to suppress most of the facts concerning the Priory. When I speak of poor Norris, they accuse me of a hideous thing. But they must know that I did not do it. I did not. They must know that it was the rats, the slithering, scurrying rats whose scampering will never, ever let me sleep. The daemon rats that race behind the padding in this room and beckon me down to the greater horrors I have ever known. The rats, they can never hear the rats in the wall. Such concludes The Rats in the Wall by H.P. Lovecraft. One of my longest stories to date, and so perfectly articulated. The story definitely built on the eldritch horror at its finest. The characters were very well fledged since this was a longer story than our usual short stories. I really enjoyed how the ending tied together the whole lineage, how the flames consumed, how the madness consumed, how war consumes. The rats are eldritch horror in such a small scale, but with the metaphors and ideology behind them, it can really be brought into a brighter light. The rats that we have in our lives are just like the rats in the walls. They're little things that eat at our insides that very well might be something that is passed down from generation to generation. This could be interpreted in so many ways, be it mental health, be it kind of like The Telltale of Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, be it even just great world building. The history is very rich. It's tied with real world events, and it's also tied with unrealistic eldritch horrors beyond moral comprehension. Overall, my favorite parts was getting to read about H.P. Lovecraft's cat. That was very interesting. I didn't know that he inserted his own cat into his stories. That's real love. I've heard rumors that he was in stories, but I didn't think that it was true. I thought it was a joke. But no, H.P. Lovecraft inserted his own cat into the story. And it does kind of add to the story in a way, because I feel like this might be some type of way of maybe the narrator dealing with something personal, but also it could just be a nod to that he really loved his cat, as H.P. Lovecraft did send letters mostly and was kind of a neat, similar to a lot of people today. I think he would have loved Reddit personally. But overall, I really loved his work. And in this one, it was very, very fast-paced towards the end. I could not stop reading. I want to look into, and I encourage below if you know, but Wally Swank Me Dice Ways, Magna Mater, Atius Dad, Ad Ultus, Don Agas Bas Dutch Ort, the Honas de Her Ort, Oculas es Ungur, means, because it just starts into an eldritch thing when he starts trying to relive this story, because it is obviously told from an insane asylum, which I had speculation at the beginning of the story, because most of H.P. Lovecraft's stories do delve into, I had this experience and now I'm going to retell it. I like how these stories start and end similar. It really ties it all together and lets you analyze each paragraph that you read as you're reading, if you can recognize his writing style. Overall, I really love that Nartholep, I always say the names wrong. Eldritch horror, you have to have a special tongue for it, you know? But I really like that we have this story previously that we've read on this channel, and it is starting to add into the universe. I tried reading shorter stories to build into the universe, and now we're getting into the meat and bones, pun intended, of the story. I also really do like that the bones, going back into that, were of different degrees, like Rome, Celtic, otherworldly. And I like how the nightmare was being referenced. As soon as I knew we got to the Twilight Grotto, I thought there would be an eldritch horror there, but the eldritch horror itself is the lineage of the family. They performed rites, they performed these summoning ceremonies, they performed cannibalism.
They performed cannibalism to such a degree that they made these bones not look human because they were interbreeding the humans and the pins. This is definitely terrifying. And a part of me wants to believe that the rats killed his dear old friend, but a part of me wonders if he was consumed by madness and he himself killed his friend. Maybe because the way that the room's atmosphere was, how he's tied to these summonings, how he himself might be a monster in a way due to just the lineage of like eldritch properties. It leaves a lot for the mind to wonder into the madness of it all. How did he even know Narthel? Like, how did he know that? Was that part of his thing? The two and Morpheus idiot flute players too were mentioned as well. It's very interesting. I wonder why his cat attacked him too, because the cat is very protective and loving the whole time, and he said that his cat was found at his neck. So I'm wondering if something escalated that just we can't explain. Unimaginable horror at its finest. How could you do something to such a dear friend who looked after your son? It's beyond comprehension to me. And the whole time, it felt like the protagonist was trying to not be a daemon, as he said his family was before him, that he was into a lineage, and I think eventually he just succumbed to it. He wants to be a better person, but he can't escape the skeletons metaphorically and unmetaphorically in his closet. They are literally in a cellar. There's a whole history of just evilty that his family has created. Overall, I would really love to see what that letter was that burned during that fire. I feel like the fact that it burned was probably for the best and that he was getting away from the curse, but I feel like the curse is just the area itself. A lot of H.P. Lovecraft's world building, people don't see it as an eldritch entity itself, but most of the time the worlds have an aura of just madness, like just being in that plane of existence. Most people don't come back from that. As we see at the end of the stories, anytime that they experience these eldritch properties that are happening in their lives, they usually end up in an insane asylum, addicted to drugs, addicted to drinking, or completely dead, and that's it. Most of the time, our storyteller doesn't come back from this. This is their life now. To look upon the eyes of an unimaginable horror is to look upon the eyes of the abyss itself. There's no coming back from that. That's all that their body can consume after that. It is like eating and never getting full. They can't stop wanting to know more. They can't stop, hearing things. They can't stop seeing things. Once it attaches yourself to you, it's over basically. You are basically a part of that entity. And that's what I love about eldritch horror, and I can also see inspiration in a lot of other horror stories. H.P. Lovecraft definitely is the king of the cosmos when it comes to cosmic horror. I think that each story I read builds onto the last, and that all the stories tie together in such a famously well done crafted way that the Cthulhu mythos is even being carried on today by other writers and inspiring writers. I personally really love that the wars were mentioned, the dates were very accurate, everything was done with very much so perfection. And I thought this would be a silly story, I'm gonna be honest. It was called The Rats in the Walls. I did not want to take it seriously, but it wasn't just the rats in the walls. It was the whole epitome of everything coming together. It is the skeletons in our closet. It is the rats in our walls. It is the ticking behind our ear that we hear that we just can't ignore. It is the call to duty. It is the call of the wild. It is the call that you must answer. It is the call of the atrocities of mankind. There's just some things that can't be buried. And this story just sums it up perfectly. Honestly, I couldn't even continue to explain on this. It just does a really good job of explaining faceless horror in itself. The fear of the unknown brought to life. The lights were even great when they extinguished and the darkness consumed. The darkness of one's own heart and soul after finding this out must be cataclysmatic. I could not imagine having the sights that you see. Typically, it's just unimaginable horror. The horror itself was very imaginable. They went into detail about how the bones were shaped, how the rats and all that, how all of this was his family's fault, and how that it just continues on because it is terrifying, it is otherworldly, it is the unknown. And once the unknown is brought to life, you can't really hide that part of history no more. As the ending says, they're trying to, but you can't really after seeing something like that. And the people that did survive are now in mental hospitals because it was just so horrifying. So just take some time to try to visualize it yourself, because after that, I felt goosebumps. And it's just reading into it, I had to read faster because I was hard for me to get through it. It was so terrifying to imagine what is underneath our feet.
Until next time, bye bye.